All right. You ready, Dan?
I guess.
Okay. Well, welcome. Today we have a very special guest. This is actually my father, Jake Vigil. And I invited him today because he is really in a unique position that might be representative of more and more people, in that he only recently started using cannabis, but this is after a lifetime of hearing contradictory knowledge and opinions and essentially positions on the efficacy as well as the safety of cannabis. I just wanted to start off by letting you know what I do, because I don't know if you know what I do, Dad. So I basically work full-time on medical cannabis research. I work on patient outcomes. I essentially decided to devote my life to this at this point because I do think that it's a partial remedy to many of the epidemics that we're facing as a society. I mention this all the time. We're facing increasing rates of chronic pain, anxiety, and depression with no end in sight. And at least according to our data, cannabis seems to be quite effective at treating those types of aversive states of the human condition. And I really think it's exciting. You know, I talked to a practitioner the other day, and he's an alternative practitioner, and he sees it analogous to discovering a new planet. That is, that there's so much potential that's yet to behold, and we know such little about the potential medicinal value of cannabis, as well as any potential negative effects, although there's been a lot of research on negative effects. But it's really exciting because this is offering individuals an opportunity to have an alternative entire, not only class, but just form of medication entirely. And I think that this is important because I do see a lot of suffering, not only from these epidemics around us, but also from what I call secondary victimization, which is essentially the negative side effects of the types of medications that are conventionally prescribed. And that's why I decided just to devote all my time into this type of work. I think it's that important. And of course I'm very biased, but I do think that it's a very special form of medication that probably has the widest therapeutic window of any medication that I've ever heard of in terms of the number of conditions and symptoms that it seems to be able to effectively treat in a relatively short amount of time with relatively minimal severe side effects. So that's why I do what I do. And again, I invited you on because you are in this relatively unique position of being exposed to all these contradictory messages, only to come to make your own decisions in ways that have led you to exposure to cannabis personally at this point. So if I could just start off by asking you to describe maybe who you are, how you came about this position of even experimenting with cannabis in the first place.
I'm 80 years old, and I've tried all kinds of things for a unique problem that I have. My problem is not being able to sleep. I have a problem. One of the side effects of not being able to sleep is that. And I've taken all kinds of medication from the store, over the counter. Nothing has ever worked. And I was talking to a friend of mine, and he was telling me that his wife has a similar problem as I do, not being able to sleep. Anyway, I've talked to my doctors. In fact, I've talked to 2 different doctors, and after we've discussed all kinds of possibilities, my primary doctor suggested, "Have you tried cannabis?" And I said, "No, I have not." He says, "You might try it. It might be an alternative type of medicine and might be able to solve your problem." So I had that in mind this whole time, but I had no idea how you go about getting cannabis. And then I found out that you can get it for medical reasons as long as you have a doctor's approval. So I went ahead and talked to 2 different doctors, and both of them agreed that I should try cannabis. It turns out that I have a friend that's been using cannabis for a long, long time, but he uses it to relax, to feel good and things like that. But his wife, she's taking it in candy form. She's taking it because she has a problem with sleep. So I kept thinking about it. We talked about it for a long time because I had a lot of reservations about cannabis for a long time. I thought that you only smoke it and that you're doing it for recreational reasons, no medical reasons. And this friend of mine's wife told me, hey, there's no side effects. It's perfectly safe. You might try it. So, not knowing where you get the cannabis, I'm totally ignorant about it. I didn't know anything about it. And he says, I can get you some and you can try it and see what it'll do. So I said, well, go ahead and get me some. But there was then a choice that I had. You can get it in different forms. You don't have to smoke it. You can get it in candy form, cookie form, and several other forms. And I told him, well, let's try the candy, which is like a chocolate. And you get that in two forms, dark chocolate and milk chocolate. And I have a preference for milk chocolate. So I said, go ahead, get me some. I'll give it a try and see what happens. Well, I went ahead and tried it, and I was instructed to do it at night when I go to bed, and I should get the effect of relaxation, and that I could probably get better sleep and feel better in the morning. So I went ahead and tried it and experimented with it. I didn't know how much I should take. Maybe they come in like a Hershey bar and in squares, and I thought, well, I'll start out by cutting one square in half and see what that'll do. And I did get a little bit of a relief on my sleeping problem. But I talked to my friend because he's pretty much an expert on this kind of thing, and he said, you might increase it and see what happens. So I went ahead and took a whole square, and then I started noticing that I was able to sleep maybe 3 hours, 4 hours, and my goal was to get at least 5 to 6 hours sleep, and that would really help me a lot. So I continued taking this, and I noticed that there was an increase in my being able to sleep, and I said, this is a possible solution. Side effects, I don't know of any side effects for sure. And I've been very cautious about not overdoing it. So I started on a pattern of using cannabis in candy form, and I started getting some extra sleep, and I said, hey, I'm going to continue doing this. I did go back to my doctors, and I told them what I was doing and what it was doing for me. And they said, well, I think you have found your solution. Go ahead and continue, and in the long term, we'll see how good it is. So my friend, I can't purchase the cannabis. I don't have a license or anything. So my friend said, no problem. He can get the cannabis very easily.
So illegal contraband at this point. No, look, I'm joking, of course.
Yeah, anyway, he has, I guess it's a permit or a license, so he's able to get cannabis for medical purposes very easily. In fact, he was telling me that there's stores all over town where you can buy it, but he had one convenient place near his home. So he started getting it for me, and I started using it. Right now I'm getting maybe 5 to 6 hours sleep, which is fantastic because I was only getting maybe an hour of sleep and sometimes no sleep at all. So I've been using it now for I guess about 6 months, and And now I have a license. I was able to get a license through permission through my doctors, and now I buy it myself. Anyway, I like the product for several reasons. One, it's doing me some good, whereas no other medication, over the counter or whatever, prescriptions, none of them work. So I'm getting some relief, and the other thing is there's no side effects that I can see that would keep me from having a question whether I should continue or not. At this point, I see no side effects that I need to be concerned about.
There's a couple points, I guess. One, it's interesting that your primary physician recommended it, to my understanding, for sleep improvement. And that's interesting because sleep in and of itself is not a discrete qualifying condition in any medical cannabis program in the United States, even though it's the most widely reported reason why people use cannabis that don't have a medical license. So it's widely used for sleep, even though it's not a health-related condition that is authorized specifically under any medical cannabis program. Obviously, sleep is vital for many different types of bodily systems, mental and physical, and impaired sleep is a major risk factor for all different types of diseases. So that's interesting in and of itself that your physician was so insightful to be able to recommend it for something that he was suggesting would be effective. Second, it seems as though, at least from the story that you've told me, that you really started off with cannabis that had THC in it from the beginning. So, you see all these signs around town, CBD, this and that, hemp, this and that. And I know, literally, I've interacted with thousands of patients, and so many have sworn that those low THC products are incredibly effective for all different types of conditions. But in our data, we show that THC is incredibly therapeutic in and of itself. So we have these huge data sets that we look at. So you kind of jumped right into the mix there. And you noted that you don't seem to experience side effects. Now, we do know that cannabis is associated with frequent side effects, but they're relatively benign. They're not very serious. So the most common being dizzy or impairments in short-term memory. You forget where your keys are. You have to take a little longer to find your keys. But it sounds as though you were taking it at night. So maybe you just weren't really experiencing those because you weren't walking around so much or trying to drive or anything like that. So that's pretty interesting stuff. Another thing is that you have evolved in how you've thought about the value of this plant relative to its risk or perhaps detriment to the individual or even society. So I obviously my whole life was exposed to prohibition of cannabis and a bunch of stigmatized terms, memes, that is like collective knowledge, that has been very negative about cannabis. In fact, our society seems to have invented special terms to stigmatize cannabis. The term stoned, doped, high in and of itself, that is one position that many patients want to deter from or to make sure that they don't experience. That is a sense of being high. Now, I would imagine that taking THC-laden products did make you high or does make you high. And I don't know if you want to comment on what that experience may be like compared to what you thought the term high meant. Or maybe you don't really feel a lot of alterations in sensory perceptions.
Well, this is one thing that happened to me. I like to experiment, and I did experiment with the chocolate. I thought, well, if I can get with a whole square, if I can get 5 hours sleep, maybe if I increase the dosage, maybe I could get more sleep. So I went ahead and tried a square and a half, and what I found out about that is at night I got up one night after having taken that, and I was dizzy. I was, I guess, high. I don't know. But it was not a comfortable high. I said, okay, no, this was not something that I wanted to continue. So I went back to the square, and that's where I am now. But as far as the history of cannabis, this is something I've heard all my life, is that it's a drug, it's illegal, it's not good for you. you shouldn't start it because it might lead to harder drugs and so on. And I'm very interested in the subject. I've read a lot. I've talked to a lot of people about it, and I'm finding out that a lot of the things that have been said in the past and things that I thought were true, I'm finding out that cannabis is probably a solution to many problems, not just my problem, but many other problems. And I've turned around, and now I'm for cannabis. In fact, I hope that our legislature votes to pass the recreational part of it. I think that this is going to be a good thing for our society. So anyway, I recommend that if you have a special problem, talk to your doctor, mention cannabis. And from what I see, I've talked to several doctors now, and doctors are now talking more about it, and sometimes even encouraging people to try it and find out if it is a solution to your particular problem. In my case, it is a solution, and I'm going to continue this. And when I talk to other people about my experience, I'm telling them that, hey, this is something that maybe has a lot of merit and something that should be considered seriously. And now I'm doing much better. I feel that a lot of the things that had been said before were not true. I'm not sure why people have said that cannabis is bad, but I think a lot of those things are not true, and I'm hoping that more people at least try it, and maybe they can find out, like I did, that it's a good thing, and that it's something that should be considered seriously.
Sure. I fully believe that if folks are dealing with chronic impairments, that they've found no relief through conventional means, even if they may not be adults, that it is in their best interest and they have very little to lose to at least experiment with cannabis relative to what they may be taking, particularly for conditions like chronic pain. All right. Well, you are in a position that is going to be representative of many people to come. So the demographic groups that are increasing their cannabis usage in 2019 are 1, older adults, and 2, individuals with severe chronic illnesses. We don't see increasing rates among teenagers, which is really interesting. So you are exposed to something that you know very little about. In fact, you're in the same position as millions of people throughout the country. And largely, information about the effects of this plant have been suppressed. They have been unable to be researched entirely for different reasons, and we're not going to talk about that today. But I want to give you the opportunity to ask me questions that you might have with regard to cannabis. I'm supposed to be an expert on the topic, but I feel most confident talking about our data. And we've conducted many different types of studies to this point with different types of clinical populations. Right now I'm doing a big study, just trying to look at the effects of cannabis exposure on otherwise normal, healthy young adults. So I'm kind of breaching a new program of research that is designed to just understand the normative effects of cannabis on the human condition, even irrespective of disease or preventative processes. So what types of questions do you think that a person in your situation that really knows very little about the subject matter might have initially? And to be honest, when I think of the average medical cannabis patient, I think of somebody in their 60s or 70s that have been dealing with a chronic illness their whole life. I have a representation of a couple that I remember seeing maybe about a year ago that walked into a dispensary and they asked the person behind the counter, "Do you have Girl Scout cookies? I heard that this will help me with my cancer." And that is all that they know, that they've heard something out there that could remarkably change their life for the improvement. And I don't know. So what type of questions do you think a naive cannabis user or somebody that might be interested or at least receptive to the possibility of experimenting with cannabis might have?
Well, one of the main questions that I have is it something that you might feel that you've tried everything else and that maybe you should give this a chance? I recommend that you go through your doctor, because your doctor can give you what is encouragement to give it a try. So my question is, we need to find out more about cannabis. We need to do more research about it. From what I understand, from what I read, there isn't enough research. And the more research we have, the chances are that the legislatures will consider it more seriously. So what are the chances of the legislature approving of something like this? What do you know about that?
Well, let's see, locally, I don't know if you know this, but Dr. Stith, my wife, my colleague also, she gave a presentation to the state Congress people about a week ago, and she was basically informing them about the trade-offs involved in legalization and sound regulation moving forward with regard to recreational cannabis policies. And from what I gathered, these folks seem to believe that recreational cannabis will go live in New Mexico within about a year and a half. At the federal level, presumably there was a bill that has been passing through Congress that is designed to deschedule cannabis entirely. So right now it's a Scheduled I substance, which means that it's allocated among the types of substances that are presumed to have no medicinal value, no known safety thresholds, and it's part of the category of substances that are supposed to be the most dangerous for the human condition, which obviously is not the case. So, a lot of people ask me about what I foresee in the future in terms of cannabis policies. I know a lot of folks do believe that big pharma is going to take over. So if it was descheduled to Schedule II substance or 3 or 4, then pharma could take over. Presumably, in theory, I don't believe that that's going to be the case, and my reasoning is that they haven't been able to control it thus far, in that it's easy for the average individual to produce it themselves. So you don't need fancy equipment, and you don't need some, real expensive building somewhere far away to be able to manufacture this stuff. Thus far, what these lobbyists have been able to do is push laws that have prohibited the use and distribution and possession and so forth of cannabis. So legally, they've been controlling the narrative. And that's where this societal ignorance has really stemmed from. And it's a multi-generational void or absence of knowledge, in that basically the types of information that medical providers are exposed to and the education that they're exposed to usually is set from these societies down. So the American Medical Association, American Psychological Association, and so forth. So by those societies essentially constraining or inhibiting or otherwise not promoting certain types of research on cannabis, essentially individuals like myself and older cohorts have only been exposed to biased information. And this is not only problematic in terms of creating a stigma around the substance, but also it has resulted in a virtual lack of federal funding for any type of research that might possibly elucidate any potential medicinal or pharmaceutical applications of the cannabis plant. And that's essentially why I started this whole new mechanism through the university to be able to procure funds that I could use to pay patients and to pay students so that they could get scholarships and spend the time training and building their skill sets around this area. And that's also the point of this channel here. It's really designed twofold. One, to allow folks to know that there is a place that they could support that is invested in this type of research solely, that is objective, sound education and knowledge on the risks and benefits of cannabis. as well as the ability to educate the general public, because there's so many people out there that can potentially benefit from this substance, and it's important for them to know objectively what they're getting into and the threshold or the trade-offs involved. So in terms of legislation, I do believe that locally it's going to be pivoting in relatively soon. I think that nationally, I do believe that Trump is actually going to flip the script prior to the next election. I do kind of intuitively feel that that's going to be the case. And he doesn't seem to be an adversary of the concept in general. So with more and more increasing exposure to objective research, really it's a slam dunk in that when you weigh the relative risks, it appears to be, as you suggest, not what we've been told. Now, oftentimes we'll hear about negative side effects. I go to conferences all the time where folks are promoting all these ills of cannabis use, and they're just really highlighting the worst that they possibly can. And they oftentimes try to give the audience the impression that these side effects are severe, prevalent, and frequent, which they are not. So they'll talk about a side effect, kind of magnify it, and give the audience the impression that this is a likely experience or outcome of exposure, when in actuality, the side effects are relatively minimal, non-toxic for human organ functioning, unlike many prescription medications, and it seems to be relatively effective. So I think it's really appropriate that when one considers the benefits or risks of using cannabis, it is relative to other types of conventional medications. And when one considers the most common types of medications, like pain medications, opiates, or antidepressants, or sedatives used for treating anxiety, it's really night and day when one considers the relative risks involved. So again, the lack of toxicity and the lack of our appreciation of continuous or longitudinal damage to the body seems to be a clear benefit of at least experimenting with cannabis relative to many of these conventional types of prescription medications. So that's where I see it heading. But you raise a really important question of, well, if recreational cannabis is allowed here locally and maybe even nationally, presumably more people are going to be exposed to it and more people are going to be experimenting with it, maybe for non-medical purposes. So a classic dichotomy that I often hear people talk about and ask me about is the distinction between medical cannabis and recreational cannabis. What might be any thoughts that you have with regard to that?
My thought on this, and this is just my opinion, that I don't think that cannabis is a solution for everybody. We're all different, and I think that there's certain people and groups that probably should not experiment with cannabis. And I was just wondering if you would say certain groups, certain people should not do this at this point. And I'm just wondering if you know of a group or an age or whatever it is that should not try the cannabis until more experimentation is done to find out just exactly what the results are for the general population. So what group would you say should not experiment or use the cannabis?
Well, I think that there's practical concerns with regard to the types of symptom or health conditions that individuals might bring to the table. So presumably individuals with pulmonary dysfunctioning, respiratory dysfunctioning may be cautioned against particularly the use of an inhaled product. Now it's interesting, but there's a lot of studies at this point that suggest that even though inhaling cannabis causes short-term tissue damage, which makes you cough, it's not associated with any long-term or at least significant long-term respiratory functioning. And these are studies among individuals that are heavy joint users, for example, for 20 years. So when compared to non-joint users or non-cannabis users in general, they don't tend to show any perturbations, at least in the long term, with regard to respiratory functioning. But that may be a group that obviously would be cautioned against at least being exposed to inhaled products. A practitioner I talked to recently mentioned that individuals with enzymatic conditions or conditions that affect their enzyme metabolic functioning may also be cautioned against cannabis, in that cannabis can affect those bodily systems, so we don't know, the interactive or additive effects and how basically the cannabis plant might interact with those types of bodily mechanisms. Certainly individuals that may not have any particular reason to use it, although really this dichotomy becomes quite confusing when one thinks about what is the distinction between recreational versus cannabis or versus medicinal use. So what is the meaning of getting high? Usually our goal as health providers and scientists is to improve the human condition. That is, to improve their subjective well-being, their sense of pleasantness, their visceral appreciation of the context of the moment, and the percepts that they're experiencing at that time, which again equals, and you could see it as analogous to the term getting high. So in one respect, feeling better is really the goal of most medical providers, and if it causes most people under most circumstances to feel better in those contexts, well, that's something to wrestle with, I guess, philosophically. Likewise, again, I mentioned that we have all these stigmatized memes or ways of thinking about cannabis that really don't apply to other types of substances. So presumably cannabis is either medical or recreational. Opiate use is usually designated as medical. Alcohol use is usually designated as recreational. I'm drinking coffee right now. It is addicting. It makes me feel better, more energy. Nobody tries to distinguish the recreational versus medicinal application of coffee. Same thing with regard to exercise. I mean, you could exercise for your own aesthetics, or you could obviously exercise for health promotion, and nobody tries to make that distinction with regard to exercise. Another interesting thing is that cannabis seems to be associated with preventative outcomes. So for example, studies have shown and have been replicated to show that cannabis users can experience up to a 66% reduction in the rate of experiencing diabetes, for example. So if cannabis is indeed a preventative form of medication, then one has to wrestle with the logic of how they can designate it as a recreational product if it has medicinal preventative potential for everybody that uses it. So it is an interesting set of questions. Obviously, as scientists and legislators and health providers, we're concerned with our youth. We're concerned with its effect on the adolescent brain as well as the developing brain, or even exposure during prenatal development. And there are many different ways to interpret how it affects the individual. Now, a common concern is that it makes teenagers lazy. I don't know if you know this, but I have used cannabis a long time and used to hide it from you when I was young. But I don't think that you would describe me as a particularly lazy person. What I do think that it tends to do is cause us to think about the world in different ways. And I talk about these topics with many different people, and sometimes I get really sound insight from my students. And one of them described it this way, that cannabis seems to result in a shift from at least what I call external expectations, or the types of goals that usually society puts on us, and kind of shifts that more towards an enhanced self-awareness and more kind of a fine-tuned appreciation of our visceral desires and what makes us feel good. And oftentimes that will result in teenagers, for example, not exploring their environment to the same extent, but just appreciating the context that they're in. And when you see that, it could be described as lazy or something completely different. And I think that that's where the role of some of us kind of folks on the frontier that are pioneering this new age have yet to reveal and understand what is exactly taking place in our minds with exposure to cannabis. Have you noticed any type of changes in how you think about things at all? I know that you said that you're sleeping better, so that's obviously got to help you throughout your day in every regard, and how you interact with other people, the ability to pursue and complete goals and so forth. But I don't know, have you noticed any type of changes in how you think about other things? I know that you definitely have become more compassionate as you've gotten older, and I think that's kind of a normal thing that we experience as males.
Well, one of the questions that I asked a few minutes ago, who would you say should not try this thing? Because I've been reading a lot of articles about cannabis and how and what the effects are for the general population and so on. But the one area that I've seen that's pretty common with many of the articles that I've read is the effect on a young brain. And what I've understood is that very young people, even maybe a person less than 18 years of age, should not try cannabis unless they have a serious medical problem. But the reason is you should not allow, say, your children or other people that are 18 or less, because the brain is developing all this time. And when you take any kind of chemical of any kind, it does affect the brain. And this is something that I don't know the answer to that. I've just been hearing a lot of things about it, but I just want to know what your opinion is about this idea that the brain is developing and THC could affect the brain in a negative way. So
I can say a couple of things. I guess, as a basic scientist, one can make the argument that this notion that the brain is not fully matured, it seems to be peculiar when one considers the context that, at least historically, humans have been reproducing at an earlier age than we tend to reproduce now. So biologically, we were transitioning from a state of learning and the acquisition of reproductive potential to actually expending that potential, procuring a mate, and starting to raise a family at an earlier age when presumably the brain is not mature. So I guess philosophically it really doesn't seem to make sense. Now, it could be the case that risk-taking during adolescence is functional and is not a consequence of the brain not being mature and making sound decisions. It could be that we think about the world at different stages in different ways, and that's not necessarily a maturational thing. It's forms of specialization across the developmental lifespan. So I do tend to argue against this notion that the brain isn't fully mature until it's in its early 20s or whatever, because it's really based on how people are measuring or operationalizing this variable or these sets of variables, and then how they're interpreting it. With regard to adolescent use and pediatric use, again, I meet a lot of families that whose parents are providing cannabis to their children that oftentimes have incredibly impairing conditions, and these kids, are desperate, and it totally brings tears to my eyes. I can't tell you how many people that come to me in full tears describing just how much cannabis has changed their life, has benefited it either mentally or physically. They often say saved their life. I hear that term all the time, saved their life. And in particular, these children have many layers that they could be improved upon with regard to how they're experiencing life in many different ways. But I do know that a lot of our adolescents and teenagers are being increasingly diagnosed with chronic impairments, that is chronic depression or anxiety and even pain. So many of our teenagers are already on these antidepressant drugs and sedatives and the types of medications that they are presuming they're going to be on for decades to come. So that's why I think that it's an important point to think of the relative risks and benefits, because if a child is already exposed to plastic pills that may, carry a whole bunch of intolerable side effects, then that is of concern. And there are many complications with different types of conventional medications. Antidepressants, for example, are associated with many perturbations in normative social, psychological functioning, as well as the ability to bond with other people and even to discern some basic elements of detecting traits in other people. So there are many ways that conventional medications alter our normal health. With regard to prenatal development, yes, one potential risk is that we're exposing the human organism to something that may create perturbations throughout development. Now, that has not been proven. Philosophically, it's interesting if we were to abide by the notion that cannabis improves pain, depression, and anxiety in adults. One must ask why it might not have those beneficial properties on the developing fetus as well. There are many scientists that specialize in how prenatal stress exposure has long-term longitudinal alterations in the trajectory of normative development. And if one could curb the types of stress responses that are elicited within the prenatal organism, then in theory that might be a beneficial thing. But as you know, most of this work has not been conducted, and it's incredibly complicated, and it carries a lot of ethical issues when we're talking about, particularly an experiment that might expose a child to cannabis. But I do see a lot of families that swear that it has improved their life in so many ways. So this is something that patients are dealing with on the daily basis. For example, the logistics of even administering their child cannabis who might be in school. So these are legal issues that we have to deal with as a society. Other types of legal issues are who has the rights, the employer or the employee, with regard to cannabis use. There's a lot of legal issues with regard to driving. We still have no actual ability to detect intoxication on the roadside. And this is complicated because cannabis stays in your system for a long time. It could be weeks or even a month. So basically a detection of cannabis might simply mean that somebody was exposed to it a month ago. And it's not really one-to-one or running in parallel with actual intoxication that might have something to do with driving abilities and driving impairment. So there's certainly a lot for us to learn, and that might be something that would also be a cautionary note. That is, individuals probably should not be experimenting with cannabis if they require operating machinery or other types of fine motor movement or even fine cognitive decision making in their daily activities, because after all, these are side effects of cannabis use. That is short-term impairment in cognitive functioning as well as behavioral functioning. And I could attest firsthand that that is the case, that sometimes you just don't have your full wits about you.
Another question that I have, and this again is from what I've read in different articles. I mentioned the use of cannabis for people that are young, that their brains are just developing, and that's fine. What I'm wondering is, what I've also seen in these articles is that there isn't enough research on how cannabis affects different ailments. Anyway, my question to you is, from what I hear you say, is that more research needs to be done so that we can understand whether we should try this for medical reasons or recreational, whatever it is. So my question is, do you feel that there is enough research in this, and or a lot more research should be done on this subject?
Yeah, well, I mean, we're trying to do the best we can here, and obviously as a society we've had many barriers in place, and I could go on and on about the logistics of actually trying to administer cannabis in a setting, different types of research designs that have been promoted by our society or suppressed or demoted in our society, and the complications of measuring the effects of cannabis. So cannabis is not like another type of intervention that you would usually test through an experiment or a randomized controlled trial. And an experiment entails basically multiple conditions, and some of the patients don't know what they're getting, or most of the patients don't know what they're getting, but they're either getting an active ingredient or they're getting a placebo. And the basic idea is that they don't know what they're getting, and the differences across the groups are going to be indicative of the effects of the active ingredient. Now, that type of pursuit really doesn't apply to cannabis, and the reason why is because cannabis is always heterogeneous by nature. It is a biological entity. It was once alive, and all living creatures are different. And even within the same batch, even when you take clones of cannabis, many different factors affect the phenotypic expression of its chemical properties, including its cultivation procedures and just exposure to different substances in the air and in the soil, and just through the pure expression of probably epigenetics. So cannabis is unique in that you can't make the same plant twice. Patients really cannot be exposed to the exact same thing twice. So your chocolates are never going to be exactly the same. And this is a problem for patients because obviously there's variability, and I think that this is actually a good thing because it forces patients to experiment with their medication. It forces them to make decisions, to monitor the effects of those decisions, and then to modify their decision making moving forward. And I do think that that's a good thing, in that we're not just reading the instructions on the back of the pill bottle, take 3 of these a day, but we're taking an active role in our healthcare decisions, and we're taking a little bit of control back into our lives, at least in that regard. There's many aspects of our lives that we seem to have very little control over. Our financial potential and financial means, the amount of time that we spend, at least certainly prior to retirement, we're forced to spend a lot of hours outside of our home and so forth, as well as our ability to heal ourselves. A lot of these things aren't in our control, and I just see this as examples of ways that our human condition is suffering. So I think that forcing patients to take greater control over their healthcare decisions is a good thing, and ultimately the human condition appreciates that.
On another question that I have, or maybe just a comment that I want to make, and that is, of all the reading that I've done on this subject, cannabis is a natural chemical, if that's what the right word is. Cannabis is a natural thing. It's been used by people for
thousands of years. And in fact, it's been used by some people as a remedy for all kinds of problems. In other words, no matter what problem you have, you take cannabis to deal with that. Personally, I'm not interested in being high or getting high. I have a medical problem, and that's the only interest that I have in cannabis. So I would not want to smoke it. I never smoked cigarettes in my life, and I don't think I want anything like of any type smoke in my lungs. So that's why I chose the candy form, because I didn't think that would have a risk factor, like it's been said, on my internal organs. So that's where I am at this point. I'm going to continue using this thing as long as it's helping me, but and everybody has to decide in what form they want to use this. So excellent.
Anyway.
Well, are there any last, perhaps, bits of information that you might want to relate directly to patients that might be in your situation, that are either starting off using cannabis or once again considering it, that you want to relate directly to them?
Well, most of the information I had originally was from a friend, his wife, and why they were using cannabis. And I started thinking, well, you might as well try something that might be a solution. Because in my case, I've tried all kinds of things to deal with my lack of sleep, and I think that people should give this a chance. It might help, it might not, but it's something that I would recommend, that should be given a time to use this, so that you never know. It might help, like it did me, and I would suggest that people should at least try it in whatever form is convenient, and that's what I think. At my age, I run out of possible solutions for my problems. But at my age, I'm finding out that it is possible to try something different and see if it's a solution for your particular problem.
Excellent. I don't know if I mentioned this, but we've recently published a couple papers on the use of cannabis for insomnia. One of them is just showing that in real time people are noting improvements in their ability to sleep, which is again what you're relaying in your own personal experiences. And then also in a different type of data set, we have shown that the entry of dispensaries into a region tends to result in a dramatic reduction in the sales of over-the-counter sleep aids. And we are making the argument that there's a direct relationship there. And with the interpretation that many so-called recreational users that only have access to the recreational market, they don't have this card like you and I do, that they are indeed switching over from some of these sleep aids to cannabis. And it just goes to show that many of these recreational users are probably using it medicinally, as maybe in ways that you suggest. Thank you very much, Dad, for joining us. I really do appreciate it, and I'm happy for you that you have been able to pivot and kind of come to an appreciation of a realization, at least according to you, that may have been different than what you thought and in ways that have improved your life. And I'm glad that you are one of the many people that I interact with daily that seems to be benefiting from this whole experience. Thank you. All right. Cool. That is really good stuff, Dad. Thank you.